if psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
A new paper reveals more intelligent people are quicker to learn and unlearn.
90% chance that there's some weird animal out there. Yeah.
Stern's been doing this forever, and far more extreme. From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. And welcome, everybody. If you're joining us for the first time, a special welcome to you. And if you're coming back for more, thanks for so much for joining us again. I'm Dave Verhagen here in Nashville. We've got a great show for you. Our trending topic today is Ready Player One. We'll talk about the movie and also video games, and that's in our second segment. But first, let's meet our Charlotte panel. Dr. Emma Kate Wright is here. Hello, Emma Kate.
Hi, Daver.
Any news for you? Anything interesting in your life?
I am very excited, and I feel like this is relevant for video games. When I was younger, I was obsessed with Crash Bandicoot on PlayStation. And
I love Crash Bandicoot.
Apparently, they are going to make an Xbox game version of this where it'll have all of them in it. And I'm waiting for August, and I even thought about pre-ordering. Anyway, so I found out about that yesterday, and I was like, oh, I'm so excited.
Super duper fun. Dr. Frank Gaskell's with us. Frank, any news in your life?
I just feel a little fresher. So I went to Kel, got my hair cut. Told him I'd give a shout out to Kel. He's very good at conversation when it comes to movies and TV. And I don't know, just my head feels better today.
This episode of the Shrink Tank Podcast is brought to you by Kel.
New products.
And you just heard Jonathan Hedderly. He's our certified Asian who rounds out the panel. Jonathan, any news in your life?
Well, recently I got a great haircut from Great Clips, and
because you're poor.
The lady that was working there pulled up the entry that said, "Okay, you want an 8 on top and a 4 on the sides." I said, "Yep, that's."
What?
Yeah, so they don't ask. They just find out what you got your haircut, and they make a note, and they do the same thing until you tell them, "No, don't do that." So
and you're out in 12 minutes. You're out the door.
Oh, if that.
I need to highlight something.
Because
I'm interrupting because Frank just acknowledged that he was rich in an off-sided way. Did anyone else hear that? He was like, "Because you're poor," to Hedderly.
Oh.
So now so Frank is acknowledging he drives a Mercedes, he's wealthy, his kids go to private school, and he gets a haircut at a nice salon.
Yeah, there it is. I would call it a salon exactly.
Well...
You call it
I believe
spa.
I believe the name is salon is in, but I wouldn't really call it a salon. Just saying.
Okay. All right. Just needed to throw that in there.
Well, each week, Jonathan trolls the internet to find a great story of psychology in the news for our first segment that we call
Be Human.
So some Arkansas students participated in the national walkout to protest guns, and they ended up receiving corporal punishment for participating in it. So in Central Arkansas, a school district gave 3 such students corporal punishment, physical punishment or spanking for their actions. That they were actually given 2 choices of punishment from the dean, either in-school suspension or corporal punishment, and all 3 students chose the latter. Now, per a Washington Post report conducted 4 years ago, Arkansas is one of 19 states that still allow corporal punishment to be administered. So, Frank, what do you make of how the school district handled the consequences of students participating in this national walkout?
Well, I mean, you know me pretty well, and I'm always a supporter of, using violence to prevent people talking about violence. Like if you want to protest violence, then I'm going to give you violence. But here's how I'm going to...
You're all for it.
Yeah, here's how I'm going to answer my to corporal punishment. The first year I was in public school was in the 8th grade. And I had an algebra teacher named Miss Holly. And Miss Holly had a paddle on the wall. And it was an old school, so the door is a wooden door and a glass opaque pane. And I had this buddy named John who probably was ADHD and just would talk in class all the time. And she kept saying, "Mr. Harris, we're going to have a holly party. We're going to have a holly party." And I'm like, I wonder what that means. Is that good? Is that bad? What's happening? Well, she said, "That's it. We're having a holly party." He got up She took that paddle off the wall, which had holes in it, shut that door, and you could see his body. You see him bend over through the glass.
Frank
and
remembers
whack,
that.
whack, whack. I mean, nailed him. He came back in, red-eyed, crying, blubbering, crying, sat back down, and Miss Holly said, "Now, don't make me do that again." That poor kid got beaten all year, and it did not change his behavior one bit. So I think it is medieval, and no offense, Arkansas, you guys are idiots. I mean, just stupid. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, when I was looking up stuff for this, there was a 2017 NPR article. Apparently, there's a school still, only one in North Carolina in the mountains that practices corporal punishment, where you can do this, get a paddling instead of in-school suspension. And the kids will typically choose the paddle because they don't want to miss class and get behind, which... I'm sorry, what? Like, I don't think I would want to get beaten by my teachers. And I always think about how there are always other choices. Like, why don't we teach our kids problem solving versus...
Because those school districts, the people in those states and communities are very, very dumb and do not know how to teach problem solving because they can't do it themselves.
Yeah.
There's no other answer.
But it's okay, fine. So maybe it's a gentle tap, like an open palm
That
swat
doesn't-
on the bottom.
that's
Well,
just
they really shouldn't be using their hands.
But it's not going to do anything.
I'd want that.
Right.
That
Well,
sounds great.
Frank would love his
Okay,
teachers to
so-
smack his butt with their
There
hands.
it is.
Welcome it.
Okay, what about a gentle, grab?
No, stop it. But you run the risk of things escalating when you're upset. And as a parent, especially, you're frustrated with your child and you want to punish them in an immediate sort of way for something they've done. If you're punishing your kid out of anger, there is a high likelihood that you are going to strike them harder than you should. So, we run a risk for these sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, the research is out there that it's not effective. And so the people that claim that corporal punishment is an effective form of discipline, they're missing all of the research and the current data. But I was spanked, not at my school, but as a child for misbehaving, and it got to the point where because it did not change my behavior, they moved up to wooden spoons. So I would get spanked with wooden spoons, and they started to break on my butt.
Well, then.
And then one time, I got caught having put a book down my pants, thinking that somehow they wouldn't notice that I had a Minecraft square butt
Wow.
and the sound of a wooden spoon getting smacked on the book. So then they went and got a 1x2.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
but clearly it worked for me, right?
Yeah.
Well, Heatherly, don't let this bother you. I'm about to cup your bottom and know that it's going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you.
That's what he says in court all the time.
Oh, wow.
I know. I had a school in middle school and high school that still did this too. And even then, this is back in the 70s and 80s, I thought, this is crazy. These are teachers hitting kids with a paddle. I just remember being a kid going, that's insane. That's a nutty thing.
It's barbaric.
I know, it's weird. Just the fact that people didn't seem to think anything was wrong with it or seem to think it was okay. It is strange. And the fact that it's still going on is pretty remarkable. I mean, like you guys said, I mean, the research on it's pretty solid. Doesn't do much, and if anything, it has the opposite effect.
And who came up with the stupid phrase, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you? It's like,
parent.
okay, well then let's switch the paddle for a moment and see if that's really true.
Yeah, let me paddle you. Well, let's shift gears and talk about our trending topic, and it's Ready Player One. It's the Steven Spielberg movie that is based on the best-selling novel. And Frank, I know you read this book. What'd you think of the book?
I love this book so much that I believe it was page 32. I had to put the book down, and I wrote a blog, at the time a blog, about the first 32 pages of the book because my mind just was completely blown.
You couldn't get through the book before you wrote it.
I literally,
That's the definition of impulsive.
I literally,
I can't even finish reading a book.
I was sitting on the porch reading the book, and I got to this one line, which was from the movie. From the Star. The kid goes to space and
Last
saves
Starfighter?
Yeah, the Last Starfighter, and the password was the password from the video game, the code from the video game, and I just said, "That's it." Put the book down, started typing.
Yep, not impulsive. Emma Kate, are you? I guess have you read the book?
I've not read the book. I did watch the trailer, and I was actually surprised because it looks really good, and it's been getting a lot of nice buzz for Spielberg as well. So I'm definitely going to see it.
Well, were you a gamer at all growing up?
Well, I shared earlier how I was very excited about Crash Bandicoot, and I would just play stupid games. I'd play like Ridge Racer on PlayStation was the interface that we used, and so it was more just like adventure games. But I never was good at first person shooter stuff, and I think we talked about this last episode where I just started playing Fortnite, and I'm horrible, absolutely horrible at aiming, and so it's not my forte. But I do see the value in it. I think it's fun.
Jonathan, did you read the novel?
I have read part of it, and I've never finished it, and it's not because I don't think it's good. I really think I am a victim of too much options when it comes to pop culture and entertainment. I mean, I find almost every evening spending a half hour trying to select what I'm going to watch on Netflix. So Ready Player One, the book has been on my night table for about a year and a half, and I've read portions of it, but I just haven't bunkered down and finished it.
So what was your relationship to video games growing up?
Not that much. Even though I'm the resident Asian, I never really got into gaming, and part of that had to do just with the socioeconomics of my family and growing up. But even when in college, my roommates and my dorm mates, they would be playing Tomb Raider and others. I'd watch it, and then I'd give it a shot, and by then the gaming was so complex, and I was not used to using more than like your thumbs, that I would get frustrated very quickly and just give up. So I mean, I've always been more about portable game systems. So Game Boy, I forget what the Sega one was. That was a portable
Genesis. The portable one.
The portable one. Oh. I had that, and then obviously smartphones, and then video games. That's sort of my bread and butter. But for the most part, since a teenager, when I got my first Game Boy, video games to me is like what you do when you're sitting on the toilet and killing time.
I'll tell you, video games for me growing up is what you live for, literally. I would get on my 10-speed, go to the mall, the Barrel of Fun, and I would have maybe $3. I would play through all those quarters, then go to the opposite end of the mall to find a big box store like a Belk or something, find a mom with a kid, and very pitifully say, "Excuse me, miss, do you have a quarter? I need to call my mom to get picked up." And because she has a kid, she's like fumbling around, and all she has is $1, so she gives me the $1. So me and my buddies hit up 3 or 4 moms across the mall.
Yeah, you did.
And we go back and we play with that money.
I'm just surprised you had friends with you.
Well, that was 8th and 9th grade. I had friends then.
Well, he'd get $1, and then he'd pay the friends 75 cents to hang out with him.
Ha. Nice.
Well, for those who don't know about Ready Player One, probably most do, but for those of you who are listening that don't know, it really is an exercise in 80s nostalgia, particularly anchored around video gaming, where a guy goes into a virtual world and then has this adventure, and it's a high-stakes adventure, and all these old 80s video games like Joust and you name it. I mean, they're all part of this story. So it's pretty good. And the early word on the movie is that the movie is better than the book. So it's reason to be hopeful. But let's talk a little bit about the bigger topic of video games. And one of the things that's in the conversation culturally now is the whole idea of violent video games leading to violence. Last week we talked about the March for Our Lives, and organized by the Parkland survivors for the Parkland shooting. and the whole push for gun reform. And the counter argument has been, hey, don't look at guns, look at video games and violent movies, but particularly violent video games. So any thoughts from you guys on the role of video games in violent behavior?
Well, I had an experience where I gave a presentation on video games and social media, and I got a letter after it from an anonymous source, which I have found out who the source was, saying I essentially should be fired. It was sent to my office manager.
Well, that's true, but, but not for the reason
we
she
all
said.
signed that letter, right?
She said I should be fired because essentially my stance on video games is completely wrong. And she has this whole bandwagon of people, like a man named John Rosemond, who's a therapist or was, that it just is using video games as the scapegoat for violence. And there's it's not it's a correlation, but it's not causation.
Yeah.
It's not even a correlation.
Yeah, I think
Well, yeah, not anymore. You're right.
there's so much evidence that goes against that relationship between video games and violence that, it's kind of like, why do we keep going there at this point? They're just, video games have become the scapegoat, essentially.
And I will also say the majority of the families that I have encountered who believe video games cause violence are conservative, Christian, and fearful people.
Yeah, and that I think that might be true, just general fearfulness about it. But the interesting thing about the research on violent video games is that there's tons of evidence that actually there's not a relationship between video game playing, violent video game playing, and increases in violence. And there's actually a decent amount of research that talks about the benefits of a variety of video games. But let me just hit you with a couple of facts. If you look at the trends from the 1990s, the rates of video gaming, including violent video game sales, has gone up steadily. In that same window of time over those past 2 decades, the rate of youth violence has gone down steadily. So even when you're talking about a correlation, and a correlation means a relationship, it doesn't mean one causes the other. But even from a correlational standpoint, big picture, there's not a connection between the amount of video game consumption, sales or playing, and violent behavior. Youth violence, despite the shootings that we've experienced, and this year's been a rough year with that, has actually gone down on average. And when Trump's talking about we need to study this topic more and making these comments, I think his quote when this first happened was, he said, "I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence in video games is really shaping young people's thoughts." And that's kind of a classic Trump
What an idiot.
line.
Yep.
But go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I was just going to say it feels like there's really two conversations that are getting blurred together. I think one would be, does violent video games cause or is responsible for violent behavior? And all the research points to there's no research that supports that.
Right.
But then I think the other conversation that I think a lot of our culture struggles with is common sense usage around technology or gaming. I think, a lot of parents that I work with and a lot of teens that I see, that the parents are just, that they've given away the power to parent their kids and implement common sense boundaries and restrictions. And I don't look a parent in the face and say, like, you're a bad parent, but we point out, like, the strategies or the boundaries and expectations you've given your kid are not clear. What do you expect is going to happen if you let your kid play video games for 10 hours or let them be on social media 10 or 12 hours? Nothing, moderation needs to be kind of a part of common sense parenting.
Yep, moderation is key.
And it's been fascinating to me to see my kids play Fortnite, and I do put restrictions on when they can play and how long they can play. But every time they log on, and it could be for an hour or something like that, some of the friends that I know they have are always on, always, which tells me they don't have any restrictions. They're just on whenever they want.
Yep. And Jonathan's right. The issue is that there are two things going on that are getting muddied. And one is, do violent video games cause violent behavior? And the second is there any bad side or downside to video gaming? And those are different questions, because if a kid plays too much, and too much would probably be over 3 hours a day, if we want to put it in real concrete terms, then we know that causes kids to have less, their quality of life is lower, their rates of depression, anxiety are higher, their pro-social interactions and behavior is less. So yes, that part's true. But as far as the video gaming causing violent behavior, even playing violent video gaming, there's not a relationship there. Here's what this research finds, and this is the other part that gets a little bit muddy. What the research has found is that kids who play some kind of violent video game, and by the way, in the actual studies, these games are not super violent that they're playing. They're like Mario kind level games. But they play the games, and then immediately they let the kids go out and play on the playground, and they watch the kids play, and the kids for the next hour or so who've played these more violent or hyped up video games are also more jacked up in their play. They are doing more rough and tumble play. They might tackle each other, roll around the ground. They might play fight, things like that. That's very different than violence. Violence is where you actually cause tissue damage to someone, where you hurt them, or where you threaten someone with a weapon or use a weapon. That's how we define violence. There's no relationship between violence and violent video games. There is some relationship between short-term aggression and playing violent video games, but by short-term, we're talking about an hour or two.
I mean, just somebody that from a very young age has been exposed to violent films and movies. I remember seeing Platoon when I was like 10 or 11, and I really didn't have a lot of restrictions on the films that I watched. But I remember growing up and hearing about Tipper Gore and rap music, or music that had sexually suggestive or violent lyrics, and the outcry that was going to pollute the minds of young people, and that eventually led to the advisory sticker on cassettes and CDs. And then I remember when NC-17 in some movies, because of their amount of graphic violence or sexualized material, was going to lead to the corruption of young people, to where we had to come up with another rating scale. There just always seems to be something that, for whatever reason, becomes the central target or scapegoat or fear. And I think social media is that for young girls, and I think it's a conversation that warrants being had, but I think there's a lot of fear, and there's a lot of people just drawing conclusions from emotions with that. And then I think video games is the other thing right now that politicians and parents are just freaking out about.
Right. And it's because they can't relate to it. They didn't grow up with it. And yet, I think we've spoken a lot about some of the downsides that people have been focusing on, but there's so much great stuff that's coming from video games. Like, there's some research that talks about problem solving is being improved, even attention to a certain extent, visual spatial skills. It requires teamwork. I work a lot with kids, and so does Frank, with individuals on the autism spectrum. And I have had kids say to me, it is so much easier for me to feel socially connected, not using those words, but that they feel like they have friends online because they're not as stressed out with some of the social aspects that are required with a face-to-face interaction. And so we're helping to improve kids' moods, to get a sense of empowerment, to help build up their strengths by allowing them to play video games. But again, it all goes back to that moderation piece. Like, don't let your kid binge watch, Netflix or play these video games, or, get them to be doing different things.
Absolutely. And
it's a moderation issue.
Yeah, and I found too that when I talk to kids about putting self-moderating and putting boundaries, and parents putting boundaries, that they tend to enjoy the game a whole lot better. And the analogy I use with kids is if every day was your birthday, it wouldn't matter. And if you have this anticipatory, I'm excited to play when I get my work done or this weekend, it makes gaming all the more enjoyable.
And what I've found, because when I give talks and I talk about technology or boundaries or limits, like parents want simple, clear parenting interventions that the kids are going to be appreciative and like. And I'm like, that's not parenting. Parenting and restrictions and moderation is the kid is going to want more. They're going to want their curfew to be later. They're going to want a larger allowance. But that I don't remember in generations past that swaying parents so much to be afraid of their kids' emotional reaction to their implementing their parental authority. But I see so much of that in today's society and culture. It's parents don't want to upset their kids.
You're right.
It's so weird. Like, honestly, I know my mom loved me, but I don't think she cared how I felt. I feel like as long as I didn't become a criminal or degenerate in society, she did her job.
Yeah, no, parents are struggling right now, at least from my perspective, to help their children understand the full range of emotions, where it's like, okay, you have this disappointment, you're feeling upset about it, and then how do you work past that? And so, parents have some work to do with some of the technology stuff for sure.
And so back to violent video games, I think the conclusion that we want people to hear is, yes, set limits on kids and set limits on your own video gaming. You really should keep your video, if you're a young adult or an adult, you should set limits on your own gaming. But the idea that violent video games leads to violence has been over and over again discounted. I'll hit you with one more interesting fact. There was a study by the U.S. Secret Service, and they studied 41 school shooters. And they found that only 12% of these school shooters had a strong interest in violent video games. There was another study that found that 85% of 15 to 18-year-old boys played very violent video games like Grand Theft Auto and other violent video games like that. So do the logic on it. 85% of the general population plays violent video games, and they don't shoot up their schools or do other major acts of violence. And among the people that do those acts of violence, only 12% have an interest in these games. What conclusion would you draw from that? Yeah,
no kidding. And to circle back to boundaries or common sense, limitations, my boundary for playing video games is when my butt starts getting numb from sitting on the toilet so long playing video games. I know it's time to get off video games and get back to living life, by golly.
I will never touch your phone again for the rest of my life.
Doctor, if you're spending that much time there.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, Ready Player One's coming out, and are you guys planning to see it? Everybody planning to go?
100%.
Yep.
Probably twice.
So maybe we can come back to it and talk about how the movie compared to the book and some of the themes in the movies that came out. But we definitely wanted to hit the bigger topic of video gaming because it's such a cultural conversation right now. All right, let's wrap this up with our doctor's orders. These are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture. And Jonathan, do you have one for us?
I do. There is an indie pop rock band called Lucius, and I've seen them live. They're a real fun kind of girl bop pop rock indie group. And recently they went on tour with Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. And in the middle of the set, they would just do this very acoustic, stripped down mini set during the concert. And they've recently come out with a new album called Nudes, which is really about how they've stripped down their sound because they use a lot of electric drums and a lot of electric instruments. And it's primarily acoustic to where you just appreciate their harmonizing and their vocals. I highly recommend it. Lucius, the album is Nudes.
I'm going to recommend 2 DVDs. One is a movie we've talked about on the show before called The Disaster Artist. It's now on Blu-ray and DVD. And the other is the movie that it's based on called The Room. You can get that on DVD, both on Amazon. And I recommend that you get both of them and have a bunch of friends over and watch a double feature. And normally you'd think you'd want to watch The Room and then The Disaster Artist, but I really think you should watch The Disaster Artist first, then The Room. It helps you enjoy both of them in a different way. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. Check out shrinktank.com for great articles and videos, including my article on violent video games and the connection between that and violent behavior. That's right now on shrinktank.com. You can also find links to our doctor's orders products that we just talked about. You can follow us on Twitter at shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. We hope you'll do that. For questions or comments, please write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hedderly, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.
Shrink Tank.